content pieces and kind of create more trust and more authority to kind of organize all of that content.
That's right. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people have been trying to organize Twitter, bringing trust to it, filtering the noise, and this was one company that did that and had significant success for a number of years, several years ago.
Okay, great. Cool.
So I never wanted to start a company. Never wanted to be an entrepreneur. I was a foreign correspondent. I was honored and really lucky to be somebody who was paid to travel to places and explain to an audience back home in Ireland, where I came from, what was going on. One of the stories that captivated me, and any foreign correspondent in the room or someone who's traveled reporting will know, there's always one story that gets under your skin. For me, it was Iran. So I watched and chronicled the journey of Iran from about 2001 all the way through, and watched a young generation being given the promise of democracy. At the very moment that I thought that this would be, a crowning moment was the elections of 2009. If you remember the Green Revolution, where kids went out, protested a disputed election on the streets of Tehran. Now, I normally would have been there, but my own company was a public broadcaster, RTE, was cash strapped, we couldn't send me. I sat at home looking at Twitter and looking at all this information, and I was listening to the television. It was a very famous British correspondent saying, he was in his hotel room, and he was phoning back to the news, and he was hearing, he said, rumors are coming in that there's been shootings on Valley Street, which is the street going through northern Tehran. I was in Dublin, sitting at home watching Twitter. I could see the bodies of the protesters who've been shot dead, being brought out of Valley Square. He was quoting third-hand reports from Tehran. I was seeing through Twitter first-hand testimony that was so much more authentic and raw than anything I had seen from, this event. And I was I said, holy shit, something's happened. First of all, scared, because it meant that foreign correspondents were no longer needed, right? Because everybody with their phone and a connection to a social network like Twitter could be a reporter. But also an opportunity, and very much like Josh. The problem is there's just way too much going on. If everybody's a storyteller, who do you listen to? And that was the inspiration, much like with Sulia, behind Storyful, that we would find the wisdom in the crowd that could tell us something that was true and authentic. And that's what I did. We went ahead, and a week later, by the way, I was at a wedding, and I was standing at the bar in the west of Ireland, and I also saw the kids, 20-somethings, gathering on their phones, and they're like, what's happening? Michael Jackson just died. How do you know Michael Jackson died? It's not in the news. Twitter's telling us. So sure enough, half an hour later, we're dancing, myself and my mother at one point, to Thriller. This is a half an hour before the LA Times reported his death. And that was the second part, was the danger of false information, of killing people off on Twitter before it actually happens. So the fear of fake news, which before fake news existed, was the secondary challenge, which was to verify the wisdom in the crowd. And those two problems came together to compel me, almost like a virus, an infection, to go and start a company.
So both in what you said and what Josh said, I feel like there's a common thread of basically for every startup entrepreneur, and I don't know any who's actually into, especially in media, okay, my future is just to create a company, let's start a company. No, it's more about observing the reality around you, correct me if I'm wrong, and basically come to realize that there's an opportunity, but at the same time things are not as perfect, are not as good as they should be, so that you come to the conclusion, okay, there's somebody has to do it, somebody has to fix this, right? And kind of bring order to chaos, curating content, be it in a way to build more trust, which I think it's so important right now. For me, when I started Watchup, there was a lot of first of all, as a consumer, I wanted a place where I could watch all of the best video news content for me in a way that was, I didn't have to constantly interact with the device, but it would more be like a lean back experience. And then there was also personally a lot of coming back to an initial passion that I got for journalism actually when I was a kid, and I still remember watching the first newscast I can remember, the first telegiornale, and it was about the Berlin Wall falling down. I was just 9 years old, and I told my mother, I want to become a journalist. And then the next day, I actually became an entrepreneur because I went to school and realized that most of my classmates hadn't heard about the news. And so I decided to scribble down a small newspaper that I sold for 500 lire at the time until we got caught by the Catholic teacher who, of course, in Italy said, hey, stop it. You guys are making money, which is a sin. You cannot do that at school. So instead of, getting a reward for that, we got reprimanded. Probably at that time, I discovered unconsciously, at least, that I should leave the country if I wanted, to be serious about entrepreneurship. But of course, as an Italian, I keep with me a lot of that, creativity and will to be creative in this business. And for Watchup, it was also about trying to go beyond. There was a boom of digital video, so we founded the company in 2012. We wanted to, very much like you, Josh, bring a little bit more of order into the chaos. And instead of building yet another video platform, it was especially for the iPad back then, that there was like all sorts of like video apps popping up and leveraging YouTube that would give you access to just any and all videos, to just give you the best, la creme de la creme in terms of video news content, because there was already, I think, a lot of availability of any sort of news content, but without that necessary screening and filtering of just finding the best sources for you. Okay, so we spoke a little bit about the motivation. Now I would love to hear, perhaps some stories about the startup journey. How did you guys go about, because you mentioned, for instance, Mark, and maybe we can start with you this time. You mentioned the fact that you didn't want to be an entrepreneur in the first place. You just wanted to fix a problem, right? So how did you go about, creating the company and, hiring people, and how did you figure that out?
With great difficulty and a lot of embarrassment, some shame, pain, disbelief of colleagues. I had friends saying to me, I think you're having a nervous breakdown, midlife crisis, all that kind of stuff. So the very first day I remember walking into this little small office that I had rented. I was on my own, there was only one person, me. And I went up and I was mapping my business plan on the whiteboard, and I realized I was using permanent markers. And I spent the rest of the afternoon scrubbing off, thinking, is this how Mark Zuckerberg, started out? But there was a lot of naivete. I think the key issues is, first of all, it's vision. And clearly you have to be, as the founder, the custodian of the vision. But very quickly you realize you can't do this without other people. If I'm not mistaken, I think Gavin Sheridan, my first colleague, is right down the back there. We went and got drunk together in the city of Cork in Ireland. And I think we mapped out the future of Storyful on a napkin in a bar. And then the next day we forgot what we described. But Gavin and myself, as the early members of the team, with more people coming on, would just sit there and try and do and fail and learn. And through that rapid, what in retrospect I now know, having studied product development cycles, is called agile development, which basically means fail quickly. Do it with people who are unlike you in other ways, right? So you don't surround people like yourself, you surround people who will challenge you. And out of that begins to emerge a culture. And so a culture, I know, is a much maligned and misunderstood word and concept, but what it is really is the shorthand that a small group of people use in every single decision they make in every single day to inform themselves almost without communicating. So I remember the first day our CTO used the phrase, he said to me, I said something, he said, that's not very storyful. And when your culture becomes like an adjective, you understand that everybody in the room can go away and do their things without you micromanaging them, because they have instilled in themselves a kind of almost, as I say, language of your company. And that comes about through shared pain. It comes about sometimes through just, things you learn in muscle memory. And so a startup really is a million different decisions, of which maybe 50.0001 go the right way. And that's the difference between success and failure. So vision first, team, and then culture emerges out of the right team. And then that becomes almost like your, as I say, muscle memory that informs the different things you do every day without thinking.
That's great. And so what defined the Storyful as an adjective for you, and how did you go about shaping that? And then also, I'm curious, did you ever see that changing over time?
It's a great question. A lot of it came out of a shared understanding of the problem. So journalism, and I think you have to remember, today is very different than 2010. I think you'll agree, Josh. I mean, in the last 8 years, we've seen, even the fact that we're having this session at all, the idea of journalists being entrepreneurs, that was kind of a ridiculous concept, even back in 2009. So in many ways, I remember one of our managing editor, a guy called Malachi Brown, he went to a conference like this and he described Storyful as kind of the X-Men of journalism. I'm sorry for the sexist terminology there, but so mutants. We were all sort of journalists, but with slightly sort of elevated, weird superpowers, whether it be, in Gavin's case, was data journalism, he was the first blogger in Ireland, or in my case, it was foreign correspondency. So I think essentially what described us was people who thought like builders and innovators and creators, as opposed to what generally defines journalists, which is observers, people who sit back and judge. And I think that was very much the culture of our time. Did it change? It changes as we added people. The biggest mistake I made as an entrepreneur was assuming that my culture needed a shock to the system from someone in sales, so I hired like a shit-kicking salesperson who came in, didn't get the culture, and I realized I made the wrong hire. And so you do actually have to, in the end of the day, part company with a lot of people. So if your vision is being changed because your team, you're hiring against yourself, then that's a potential fatal, mortal moment. If your culture changes without you knowing it.
That's great to hear. Josh, for you, so can you tell us some stories about that startup journey? How did you go about putting the company together? What was the culture like? And so on.
Let's see. Here's an example from the company I'm currently working on. It's just me and a CTO. So we build messaging apps for professional communities. At the center of each messaging app, we have a team of anchors. Those anchors include journalists. So we launched an app on the subject of salumi or charcuterie last fall. It happens to be a passion of mine. So I found, I had a friend who's very well known in the States for charcuterie. He wrote a book on it. And we said, okay, what we're going to do is he's going to have this app. It's going to look like a messaging app, but he's going to put journalism in it, and that's a great environment in which to have a conversation. So his sort of stuff that you might call content could transition easily to conversation. And one of the sort of big mega trends that we believe in is that there's sort of a collapse of content and conversation in the world today, and that we wanted to sort of further that trend. So we launched this app called Charcuterie.
And sorry, what do you mean by collapse of content and conversation?
I mean a convergence of the two. Twitter's a good example. Like if you look at a tweet or a series of tweets, it's not clear whether that's content like is in the kind of stuff that's traditionally professionally programmed or produced, or whether it's sort of a verbal back and forth, right? Twitter is a good example. Some tweets are just the headline of the article, and some are people chatting back and forth. And one of the reasons I think Twitter works really well as a product is that its product can support both of those modalities. So that was one of the threads for this product that we've built. So we launched this product called Charcuterie, and we had this guy at the center of it. His name's Michael Ruhlman. He had a bunch of Twitter followers. So the idea is that he would be able to attract people who are really passionate about the subject, and because of the trust that he already had on that subject, he would be able to inspire people to pay for membership. So you pay $5 a month and you get access to this community of people who are all super passionate about this subject, with conversations being sparked and curated by this guy and his team. So we positioned it, or sort of marketed it to charcuterie obsessives. And what we found very quickly is that 3/4 of the people who signed up were identified as professionals. So they were a butcher, and they did some charcuterie stuff, or they were actually a charcuterie professional.
Versus consumers, right? They were not really consumers. They were more like on the producer side.
Exactly.
Like
they were
pros.
Right,
yeah.
right. And we realized that their information needs and their networking needs were much different from those that we had sort of designed this for. This guy, Michael Rollman, he's written like 20 books, and he's a well-known personality, but he's not like the world's most famous, like he's not a charcutier. So he personally wasn't that great at dealing with the people who had signed up. And in the meantime, these people who had signed up were paying only $5 a month and wanting much more information and interaction than $5 could support. So this is an example of a startup launching something and learning pretty quickly that something was off. So we've basically shut down that app, where we found a new anchor for it. Somebody who's much more knowledgeable, who is a practitioner, who is a professional, and we'll relaunch that. And in addition, all the apps that we'll launch going forward will be focused on professionals. So that was just a really good example of we built it really quickly in 3 or 4 months, just an iPhone app. I won't go into all the design and technological sacrifices we made. And then we learned very quickly in a couple months that we had totally mispositioned this thing and needed to shut it down and relaunch it. And that's, I'm in the middle of that. So, and it currently is very painful.
Josh, and do you have any technical background yourself?
I'm not doing any of the programming for this company, but I do have a technical background.
Okay. Lucky you, because I think that one of the, at least for me, being a founder of what essentially was a software product, I always found probably one of the hardest things to do was to design a product that I would actually not make myself.
Yep.
And the analogy that I often do is like if you are the owner of a pizzeria, but you don't have a clue about how to make pizza. That's completely doable. You just hire a good, pizzaiolo. But the catch is that with pizza, you can have a sense, especially if you are Napolitan, to what is the right flour. You know a thing or two about what doppio zero means, etc. With code, it's so hard. Huh?
I'm getting hungry. Just charcuterie and pizza.
Right. So you really have to be smart about the way you go about it, because of course it would be so hard and so I think time consuming to just learn everything you can possibly do, but you have to get to a point where although you cannot make the dough of the pizza, you can at least understand the ingredients, so that when there is a conversation about Python versus Node.js, for instance, you can at least ponderate what are the pros and the cons, because the truth is that, like, for instance, a choice about which programming language or framework to pick is going to have a huge impact on the business. And so, in the Valley, there's a lot of chatter about, can you really be like an effective non-technical founder of, what essentially is a software company? The reality is that it's quite hard. What do you guys think?
Well, suppose I'm not a product of the Valley, and nor am a technical person. I have worked for Silicon Valley companies. I worked for Twitter. I was obviously, pitching to Silicon Valley investors. I was competing against Silicon Valley companies. I have to say I draw a very strong counterpoint between a European style of innovation and a Silicon Valley innovation. I do think that, being an entrepreneur is an absolute management of contradictions. So, on the one hand, you've got to be absolutely certain you're going to succeed, but only 20% of companies succeed, right? So you know that you've got to also be realistic about your chances. You got to tell people you're an absolute shoe-in, it's going to happen for you, but deep down you're kind of lying to everybody. You go to an investor, you show them a hockey stick at the end of 3 years that shows your profitability is going to go through the roof. You know that they know that you know that they know that you know it's all bullshit, right? But you just have to go through this. And so after a while, you just get used to the concept. It's not lying, it's just parallel alternative facts, let's put it that way. So sometimes you can know too much about a subject. Because you walk into, I remember this vividly, going into news organizations. We were what we call an enterprise product, B2B. We weren't going to the consumer. So we were selling to executives, people who had a problem. We wanted to convince them we had a solution. And we'd sit down, and I could say sometimes you could actually see their eyes glazing over as we would explain why user-generated content is going to be the wave of the future. They're just thinking about, can you get me more page views, money? And you're saying, no, you don't understand. Like, you're going to be here. You're going to do this in 3 years' time. Like, I think Sulia was ahead of its time, and knowing what you did at the time was like break things down, managing information overload, which is the way of the future for journalism. But if you know things too much, you assume they know it too. And I think sometimes you don't have to be the best. In fact, sometimes it's not the smartest people in the room who are the CEO. Certainly in my case, that was the case. I wasn't the smartest person. And sometimes I think you do get too caught up in the Silicon Valley bullshit. Like, there's a great podcast called Startup, which you guys have probably all heard of. It's a guy who sets up his podcasting company, Gimlet. I don't know if you know.
That I love that startup, or that podcast, but I also hate it because he ultimately raised money so easily.
I know. It is. He started, and but the second episode,
Fourth episode, he's got $1 million from Chris Sacca.
Yeah, he's pitching to Chris Sacca. I don't know Chris Sacca. He is one of the early founders or investors in Twitter, etc. And he's on the phone to his wife. The concept is the guy's decided to leave his his safe journalism job at NPR, and he's going to record every single moment of his journey.
Gimlet Media, right?
Gimlet Media.
Yeah.
Second episode, he's just pitched this guy, Chris Sacca, on the way to his Uber taxi. And Sacca's basically said, it's not big enough. And he's on his phone to his wife saying, but this is the biggest thing I ever did in my life. It's not big enough for him. And there is that contradiction sometimes, that it's the biggest thing. I don't know how many people here will consider a startup. But you may have a small problem you're trying to solve. And for you, it's huge, and it will make an impact. You won't be a unicorn. You're not going to get up at some tech founders summit and be celebrated in years to come. You may not earn a huge 8 times, return for your investors, and that's okay. You don't have to be Zuckerberg or Dorsey. You've got to solve a problem, you've got to make money for it, and you've got to basically, in some ways, I hope, make a difference. And sometimes Silicon Valley can give you a false sense of A, your own importance, but B, also your lack of importance. So be very careful about buying into the foosball tables and the billion-dollar valuations, and we got loads of customers with no revenue, because they're all the roads to not just failure but madness.
Yeah, and so when we built Watchup, started in 2012, and we sold the company last December. So we announced that, and of course, my being Italian, the Italian press reached out, hey, tell us about it, etc. And so they published articles on several outlets, and of course a lot of fellow Italian wannabe entrepreneurs started reaching out, and I think like a common thread in those requests for help, for information, etc., which I always try to answer in a way or the other, we're starting from a lot of false assumptions. Like a lot of that alternative reality, alternative facts, which is basically the fact that Silicon Valley is that El Dorado, that perfect land where you come and you have investors begging you to take their money, and you can find a lot of engineers who would come on board, be on your team to build that wonderful idea that you got, and I think that if there is one thing that those people who are reaching out to me got completely wrong is also the importance of the idea. I think that we are very much an idealistic nation and probably continent. I think that we glorify ideas a lot, probably more than what they are actually worth, because at the end of the day, ideas are important and they are kind of the seed, but you cannot make a tree with just a seed, right? You need very good, earth, and you need to put the water at the right times. Sometimes if you put too much water, it doesn't work, and you have to get the right climate, etc., etc. So I think that is very important, because you can have all the best ideas you want, but if you're not able to execute and create the actual product, you're not going to go anywhere, right?
I think one plank of the pitch to a VC, if that's how we want to frame this, has to be that it can be big. To your point about Gimlet Media, I think of the idea as like a necessary condition, and specifically that it has to be some theory about how it can be massively large. This is specifically from a VC venture capital perspective. Other than that, you're absolutely right that the way to think about it, and the way I think about it is how many people used our thing last week and today, and is that going up over time? And venture investors think about it the exact same way. Like really, really very simply, like they call it tractions, the word
Yes.
that you'll hear in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, and it doesn't matter.
Can you define traction for the audience?
It's specific to the product or service you have. So, for a consumer-facing product, it's probably how many people are using it monthly or weekly or daily. For a B2B product, it might be revenue or whatever other sort of like metric that you really care about. That's really like the start and the finish of conversations. I mean, people raise or don't raise rounds, especially seed rounds and Series A rounds with like, do you have like 10,000 people using this thing or 100,000 people using this thing? And the difference, even if it's not what you want your product to be a year from now, it can make all the difference.
Great. Okay, so I would like to, while we continue the conversation, tell you that we are all for questions. So if you guys want to come to the conversation.
Could I ask maybe how
Yes.
many people in the room have either started a company, want to start a company, or may decide to start a company? Great. I just think I wanted to check that because I think ultimately sort of lets us know there may be more practical stuff if there is.
Yeah. So perhaps you touched a little bit on the fundraising part. Mark, you want to talk a little bit about your fundraising experience?
Yeah, I think again one of the things I noticed early on was there's a lot of things that you assume you have to do that investors actually don't need. So investors don't want all the answers. They don't want you to have basically solved every single problem that you may encounter in your first 3 to 4 years. They want you to have asked every single question. They want you to have anticipated the different outcomes that can happen, because your idea day one is not going to be your idea 3 years hence. And so the best ever advice I got was my lead investor was a guy who had formed a company called Hostel World, who went on to invest in a company called Skyscanner, which you might be aware of. Skyscanner, yeah. He sat me down in a coffee shop and he said, right, in 3 years' time, you're going to be worth this amount, I'm going to earn this amount to the company, and I think you're going to sell to these guys. And he had about 3 or 4 companies. He was 6 months out. But what he had done is he said, listen, everything I do, I go into it with a nirvana. What's the nirvana out of this decision I'm going to make, whether it's to invest in the company, start the company? And then I work at every single thing that could happen on the way to nirvana and decide if I have to take a left turn or a right turn, what that might be. I don't know the answers. I just know I've asked the questions. So if I give you this money, obviously addressable market. What's the size of the market you're going after? What are people buying about you? When are you mission critical, i.e. people couldn't do without you? You're not just a nice to have, or they'll buy you if they have enough money in their pocket, but you're must. So that was the first thing I decided, that I realized that they don't necessarily want you to have set down an exact figure at sort of 3 years hence. They just want to know how you're going to get there and what happens if something doesn't go right. The second thing was domain experience, particularly for media startups. You need to have investors, choose them wisely, because if they don't understand your business, they'll use the comparison of, let's say, if they're in advertising or if they've been in deep tech, they'll use a different business to judge your success or failure, and that is so dangerous. They'll sit down and say, why aren't you a .com? Well, because I'm actually selling to other businesses. I'm not going to be a big multiple. And the next thing to understand as well is that as a media startup, it's very different, because you're generally mixing two, not just cultures, but personality types. Your engineers, the technical people on your team, are kind of pretty much like, they almost have a form of Asperger's. They're kind of very focused on things in front of them. They'll solve problems. The journalists, the media people, are generally kind of attention deficit disorder, right? There's there's a shiny thing over there, and they're missing the execution of the idea. And to marry those two cultures and mindsets together is the absolute core of what you will do as a media innovator. Because when they do add together, they are more than the sum of the parts. And that's why I'm a big believer in this concept of agile development. Take people from different parts of your business, bring them together, small groups, with a general idea where you're going, but a constant process of iteration and failure and learning and doing it again, like your charcuterie example. That's more important than ever, I think, for media companies. And if you get the wrong investor, they will not get that concept. So choose your investors almost the way that you think they're going to choose you. Final point, you start off at the back of your brain, in your amygdala, your lizard brain as they call it. It's where, when you were basically, your ancestors were running away from dinosaurs, fight or flight. That's what governs your mind in the early days. You're paranoid, everything's a threat to you, you literally are reacting with instinct. You need to get into the front of your brain from where optimism and idealism and clear thinking come from. And that requires you to confront your worst fear and realize it's okay. I was driving home to my family's home in the west of Ireland one Christmas Eve. I'd refused investment that morning. My business was over as far as I was concerned. I didn't tell my wife until halfway through the journey, and she said, it's okay, you'll get a job somewhere else. And by the time I got to the house, I got a call from the lead investor to say, I'm not taking no for an answer. Here's the money. The business was back on again. Confronted my worst fear, Christmas Eve, and it was okay. And from then on, that was a real liberation for me. And after that, I didn't really have a great deal of fear about the journey. That sounds like some sort of movie. Miracle on 34th Street.
So I think those stories are great because we're trying, I think, doing this exercise to kind of give you guys, share with you, especially with people who want to start a business in the media space, some rules of thumb in a sense, but also some stories and anecdotes that we can share. So for me, I came to the US, San Francisco Bay Area, 2010 on a night journalism fellowship at Stanford. Stayed there 1 year, and then I joined StartX, which is the Stanford Startup Accelerator, as an entrepreneur in residence. And I didn't have the idea for Watchup yet. I was, simply hanging out with other people who wanted to start their company, kind of share my experience previously in what I had built in Europe. And then I got the idea for Watchup, and of course, I had a family. I had a wife, I have 2 kids to support in one of the most expensive parts of the world, and so I wasn't exactly that type of bohemian type who can, run on a dime, etc. No, we were, living in Palo Alto, and so of course I had to, figure out how can we bootstrap. And bootstrap means to basically build something without any money. And so what I did was to, do several things. So one, and that was, one of the very first things that I understood while being at StartX, surrounded by all of those awesome startups, was that before even you get started with investors, you have to find a good lawyer. And that lawyer can basically guide you through the process so that you can really use all of your weapons, even before finding financial resources. Good news is that you have Delaware corporate law that is on your side. And so you can create a company, usually a Delaware corporation, although you're based in California, and basically leverage a lot of things in order to basically give shares of a pie that actually doesn't exist yet, right? Because there was no value. Like, it was all here in my brain. I don't know if in the back, in the front, but somewhere. And I had to share a little bit of that with somebody. But they always said, no problem, you just give the options. So they figured that out. And so I found a technical co-founder who basically worked for 7 months without being paid and who built the initial app. And, to your point of the traction, basically, the traction thing, that is so important for investors because it's, there's hardly one meeting that I got that ended up in, here's the check. There wasn't, in fact. It was just several meetings where, sometimes spaced of like 2 weeks between one and the other, and you had to show something that you had done in those 2 weeks. You couldn't just say, oh, I went to San Francisco, it was fine, and I found a great pizzeria. No, you had to really, give some data, some numbers, some hires that you had done, some early partnerships, intents, and stuff like that. So putting all of that together, but it was painful. I mean, just to give you an idea, I probably contacted, of the funnel, right? For that first round, we raised $500,000. I contacted about 1,000 investors, got probably 100 meetings, and ended up having 11 checks. So it was, all like, okay, 10%, 10%, 10%. And all of the first 30, 40 meetings were all no's. So all slaps in the face, one after the other. No, boom, no, boom, no, boom. So a lot of people, of course, and I get a lot of emails, and I follow a lot of entrepreneurs, that they would have just given up. And so for me, it was, no, I know that this is the right thing to do. I understand the market. I know that there's going to be a need for that. I know this is a good idea. But at the same time, so you have to have that tenacity and, as they put it, thick skin. No? But at the same time, you also have to be very adaptable and very receptive to all of those feedbacks, so that my pitch in reality, looking back, was never the same, from an investor to another. Because first of all, I would do a lot of homework, understand what those investors really cared about, the companies they had invested in before, probably had talked to somebody who had received money from them, if I really wanted them. And more importantly, after getting all of those no's, I kind of try to find what was that thing that was really missing and that was really, really important. So I would say a lot of tenacity, a lot of, at the same time, flexibility, and kind of, seeing where you want to go, no matter what. Okay, any questions or ideas you guys wanted to share, or simply experiences, if you have your own like painful experience you want to share? I said that as soon as I pronounced the name pain, somebody raised his hand.
Okay, speaking of pain, you mentioned how important it is when you speak to investors to address what kind of customer pain you're actually solving or trying to solve with your media startup. And what I've learned from my own experience, and also from a lot of would-be entrepreneurs I know, is that it comes to explaining what pain you actually solve when you're doing a journalism startup. It oftentimes just boils down to, yeah, we're doing reporting, and they say, yeah, but other people do reporting as well, and then you say, yeah, but we do the better reporting. So this is the one special kind of reporting that we just hope people won't be able to do without, but that is a very hard point to sell. And but if you look at highly regarded media outlets like the New York Times, I mean, what is the pain they are solving? They are a highly regarded news outlet that does excellent reporting, but that's about it. And you can maybe list some features. So in your experience, in your opinion, do you think there is room in the investors market for media startups to basically just try to sell on the point of quality, especially when it goes more into general interest reporting? Or does everybody really have to nail down into an extreme niche, something like the information, to cater to a very, very specific clientele that will be able to shell out the money?
And can you share what's this company and your background real quick?
Oh yeah, my company is called VaynerMedia, and we started in 2013. And we started an online science magazine, which was paid content, so we had a subscription model, and we ran out of money pretty quickly.
Did you say fail better?
Fail better, yeah.
From the famous Sam Beckett.
Yes.
Ever tried, ever failed, no
yeah.
matter, try again, fail better.
Yeah,
that is the credo of the media entrepreneur there.
Yes.
Yeah, and when we tried to raise funding from investors, it always came down to this, okay, but what is the pain you're solving? We said, yeah, we do it better than the others. And they said, that's not enough.
I think I would say one thing, and I think Josh would say the same as well, and you guys, but the problem we have sometimes speaking as media entrepreneurs is that we kind of make generalized statements that we think apply to everybody, when in fact the journey is so personal and deeply different for everybody. The big categories of difference are you B2B? Are you building like the pipes and the foundations that make other people's businesses work, which I actually personally think is where the growth will be in media innovation right now for young startups. Is, are you fixing the problems that will allow the system to work, versus thinking you're going to be the next BuzzFeed. I think the idea of scaled mass audience startups, trying to be Jonah Peretti, I don't think it's the time. I personally don't think so. I may be wrong. Maybe someone out there does have the next Mike, BuzzFeed, whatever. But right now, I think it's not about necessarily quality, but trust. So the way I see it right now, online media, digital media, is kind of like we all have these fastest cars imaginable. but we don't have any roads to drive them on. We don't have speed limits. We don't have traffic lights. We don't have someone maintaining the security of the system. And I really feel right now we've moved so fast, the destruction of the old business model, the old system of distribution of news, that the people who are going to be very successful are the people that make it easier for other businesses and premium users get better experiences out of their social web experience every single day, whether that is filtering, whether that is niche. Like you say, I think there definitely is. I would dig deep, deep, deep into niches, whether it be meat or it be some other passion that people have. And think about chemical reactions in people's brains, like dopamine. You know, the moment you find something new, there's a chemical goes in your brain, makes you feel good. Monetize those feelings, those emotions people have. So, yeah, that's my feeling. I may be completely wrong, and maybe someone else has a different experience. But I think right now it is the people building sometimes the unglamorous businesses that will be the next billion-dollar media companies. It will come out of that, as opposed to, you know, exploding watermelons and, you know, 50 million views for 2-second videos, which I think is not the way of the future.
Is there any other input? Maybe let's take more
Sure, yep.
interventions. Okay.
Yeah, I'm curious to know.
And please introduce yourself.
I'm
That
sorry,
would be great.
My name's Ian Gill. I'm the president of a year 3. We had our 3rd birthday last weekend. A startup called Discourse Media in Western Canada. And we're about to go to investors. We've managed to survive so far without them. And we're terrified about valuation. So I'm curious about your experience in valuing what you built at whatever stage you'd built it, even if it was just an idea, and how much you had to give up. You know, that conversation with investors, you know, what are you, you know, just
What kind of
pricing?
investors are you going to talk to?
Well, we're going to talk to some VCs, but we also have some what I would call sort of social investors. There's some people we think we know actually are probably going to invest in us to some degree because of the social impact that we're hoping to create with our journalism, to the previous question in a way. But the other thing is we're sort of nervously thinking we may also just talk to some sort of straight up VCs.
I'll say this with the proviso that I don't know about the company. I think that the investors I'm most familiar with, VC investors, aren't going to want to take too much of your company to start. They know that you'll, they want to invest in a big company. They know that a big company needs to have multiple stages of capitalization. They know that each stage of capitalization is going to dilute you or take more and more of your company. They know that by the end of it, you're not going to have a tremendous amount of the company left, which means that they know if at the start they take a tremendous amount of it, you'll have a vanishingly small amount at the end, and their worry at that point is that you won't be motivated to swing for the fences, as they say. So, I mean, without knowing anything about the business and the metrics and the team and all that, my advice would be not to worry too much about the valuation. There are some sort of like standard places where you're going to be. I mean, you know, you're probably looking at raising $1 million or, you know, 500K to 2.5 or something in there, and it's going to be for, you know, 20 to 40% of the company or something like that, depending on your traction. I would worry about a very long list of things, but I wouldn't worry about that.
So we only have 6 minutes left, and I'd love to take as many questions as possible.
Just one quick word of advice. I see a lot of hands going up in the room over here about people who want to set up a business. I quit a well-paying job as an EU correspondent for CNBC 10 years ago to set up a TV project in Brussels. I made some financing mistakes. And you hear all the talks about equity, but in Europe there is a lot of debt financing. And the banks will give you money if you start getting a little bit of revenue. That's a trap to fall into, because once your business plan does not develop, you end up with maybe half a mortgage or more in debt that you will continue to have to pay off. The risks in developing your business, if you go into equity, the American model, risk-carrying money, like the funds that go into Storyful, are basically, if it fails, then that money is gone. You will not have debt coming into it. It's a word of advice from the practice that I've had for the last 10 years. I now have a good job in public relations, so I'm able to pay my debt. But if you want to prevent that situation, stay with equity and don't go into debts. Don't talk to your banks.
I think it's great advice, and I do think while I would say, you know, fortune favors the brave, don't be stupid. Like, risks are risks, but they have to be calculated. You know, and one of the things you don't know is it's a mental game. You've got to take care of your family, the people that love you. You've got to know that they're on the journey with you as well. You've got to understand that, can you take it? Are you resilient? Can you take negative feedback? Can you take the 60 rejections? If you have any doubt, do not do it, right? And I sound like I'm here entirely, you know, very pessimistic, but I think you're absolutely right. So your journey, I think, is a brilliant example of, I'm assuming you're glad you did it, even in retrospect. You learned from it. Definitely. Right. But sometimes, you know, if the risk is so high that you're losing something very deep to your family, to your soul, to yourself, you know, have a second thought.
Okay, so looks like we have just one more question.
Oh, I feel like there's a lot of pressure on this now. I'm from the other side of the fence. I'm a director of the Ferret, which is a cooperative. So we're a startup, but we have no equity, so you can't buy into us. And we've been running a couple of years, reasonably successful. We just got a Google grant. But one of the questions I had, because coming from a cooperative background, which is I think this is going to be one other strand of media going forward, will be cooperatives. How do you get journalists to think more like businessmen? Because for a cooperative to succeed, it also has to be a viable business. And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to wrestle with myself over the last year and in the future. So just kind of wondering, as journalists who became businessmen, what's the advice for that?
Think the opposite way you were taught, right? As journalists, we don't fail. We can fail. We go on the front page with the wrong story. Failure has a huge cost. You've got to suddenly turn your mind around thinking, well, actually, I've got to fail. The only lessons I will ever learn will be from failure. You will not learn from success. Success breeds essentially a real sense of, like, I don't know, I've only taken bad decisions when I've been succeeding. The other thing I would say as well is about being a journalist turned to a business person, it's about leadership. It's not about being a business person, it's about leadership, which is the idea that you are going to inspire people to do it for you. I built the team that built my company. I didn't build the company myself. So there is a certain amount of ego tempered by a realization that you're not there to do it all. You don't micromanage, and you have to embrace failure because that's the only way you'll sort of succeed in the end. These sound like platitudes, but you know they're real when you live them.
Josh, you want to?
I'd say that if you're building a company, you need to be very, very modest about where you think you know it's going to go. You don't. The way to build something that's very successful in 3, 4, 5, 10 years is by doing something good today and something a little better tomorrow and something a little better the next day. And what that means is that it's extremely important not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say. Do something concrete today.
So, love that. I also want to finish up on some positive notes. I think that being an entrepreneur is the most beautiful job on earth. I'm, now we sold the company. I'm not an entrepreneur anymore. I've gained a lot of sleep and, a lot of health, a lot of family time, a lot of mind space. When I go to conferences, I'm no longer into my tunnel, building the thing. I'm just like breathing. But God, how I miss, that being, at the center of the thing, getting the big picture and building something. It's painful. It's very painful. It's risky. It's very risky. But it's, I think, the most beautiful thing on earth because you are building something. In our field especially, you are building something to change the way people consume news. It's just the most beautiful thing. So go out and change the world and ci vediamo. Ciao.
I think it might have been called back then. Yeah, absolutely. I think we pivoted.
You guys definitely were around.
I don't remember when we pivoted, but yeah.
No, because I definitely had that conversation.
Yeah.
Like Austin, sort of rich, cool house. Hi. Hi, Lisa.
unconsciously, at least, that I should leave the country if I wanted, to be serious about entrepreneurship. But of course, as an Italian, I keep with me a lot of that, creativity and will to be creative in this business. And for Watchup, it was also about trying to go beyond. There was a boom of digital video, so we founded the company in 2012. We wanted to, very much like you, Josh, bring a little bit more of order into the chaos, and instead of building yet another video platform, it was especially for the iPad back then, there was like all sorts of like video apps popping up and leveraging YouTube that would give you access to just any and all videos, to just give you the best, la creme de la creme in terms of video news content, because there was already, I think, a lot of like availability of any sort of news content, but without the necessary screening and filtering of just finding the best sources for you. Okay, so we spoke a little bit about the motivation. Now I would love to hear, perhaps some stories about the startup journey. How did you guys go about, because you mentioned, for instance,
gathering on their phones, and they're like, what's happening? Michael Jackson just died. How do you know Michael Jackson died? It's not in the news. Twitter's telling us. So sure enough, half an hour later, we're dancing, myself and my mother at one point, to Thriller. This is a half an hour before the LA Times reported his death. And that was the second part, was the danger of false information, of killing people off on Twitter before it actually happens. So the fear of fake news, which before fake news existed, was the secondary challenge, which was to verify the wisdom in the crowd. And those two problems came together to compel me, almost like a virus, an infection, to go and start a company.
So both in what you said and what Josh said, I feel like there's a common thread of basically, for every startup entrepreneur, and I don't know any who's actually like into, especially in media, okay, my future is just to create a company, let's start a company. No, it's more about observing the reality around you, correct me if I'm wrong, and basically come to realize that there's an opportunity, but at the same time things are not as perfect, are not as good as they should be, so that you come to the conclusion, okay, there's somebody has to do it, somebody has to fix this, right? And kind of bring order to chaos, curating content. Content pieces, and kind of create more trust and more authority to kind of organize all of that content.
That's right. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people have been trying to organize Twitter, bringing trust to it, filtering the noise, and this was one company that did that and had significant success for a number of years, several years ago.
Okay, great. Cool.
So I never wanted to start a company. Never wanted to be an entrepreneur. I was a foreign correspondent. I was honored and really lucky to be somebody who was paid to travel to places and explain to an audience back home in Ireland, where I came from, what was going on. One of the stories that captivated me, and any foreign correspondent in the room or someone who's traveled reporting will know, there's always one story that gets under your skin. For me, it was Iran. So I watched and chronicled the journey of Iran from about 2001 all the way through, and watched a young generation being given the promise of democracy. At the very moment that I thought that this would be, a crowning moment, was the elections of 2009. If you remember the Green Revolution, where kids went out, protested a disputed election on the streets of Tehran. Now, I normally would have been there, but my own company was a public broadcaster, RT.
Be it in a way to build more trust, which I think it's so important right now. For me, when I started Watchup, there was a lot of first of all, as a consumer, I wanted a place where I could watch all of the best video news content for me in a way that was, I didn't have to constantly interact with the device, but it would more be like a lean back experience. And then there was also personally a lot of coming back to an initial passion that I got for journalism actually when I was a kid, and I still remember watching the first newscast I can remember, the first telegiornale, and it was about the Berlin Wall falling down. I was just 9 years old, and I told my mother, I want to become a journalist. And then the next day, I actually became an entrepreneur because I went to school and realized that most of my classmates hadn't heard about the news. And so I decided to scribble down a small newspaper that I sold for 500 lire at the time, until we got caught by the Catholic teacher, who, of course, in Italy said, hey, stop it, you guys are making money, which is a sin, you cannot do that at school. So instead of, getting a reward for that, we got reprimanded. Probably at that time, I discovered...
He was cash strapped, we couldn't send me. I sat at home looking at Twitter and looking at all this information, and I was listening to the television. It was a very famous British correspondent saying, he was in his hotel room, and he was phoning back to the news, and he said, rumors are coming in that there's been shootings on Valley Asser Street, which is the street going through northern Tehran. I was in Dublin, sitting at home watching Twitter. I could see the bodies of the protesters have been shot dead, being brought out of Valley Asser Square. He was quoting third-hand reports from Tehran. I was seeing through Twitter first-hand testimony that was so much more authentic and raw than anything I had seen from, this event. And I always said, holy shit, something's happened. First of all, scared because it meant that foreign correspondents were no longer needed, right? Because everybody with their phone and a connection to a social network like Twitter could be a reporter. But also an opportunity, and very much like Josh, the problem is there's just way too much going on. If everybody's a storyteller, who do you listen to? And that was the inspiration, much like with Sulia, behind Storyful, that we would find the wisdom in the crowd that could tell us something that was true and authentic. And that's what I did. We went ahead, and a week later, by the way, I was at a wedding, and I was standing at the bar in the west of Ireland, and I also, the kids, 20-somethings,